So we are in Virginia, and today we've been exploring the grounds of the Mount Vernon plantation. Now, of course, whenever you think of Mount Vernon, the first person that you're probably going to think of is George Washington. If you gave it a little bit more thought, you might even consider Martha Washington, or maybe some of the more famously historic guests that were entertained here at Mount Vernon. But there was another group of people who lived here on this plantation. And you would have found them in places like this, working in the gardens, working in the fields, working in the vineyards, or tending the livestock. And of course, I'm referring to the enslaved people of the Washington family. So today, we're going to set aside a little bit of time to explore the lives and the work and the struggles of the enslaved people here at Mount Vernon. In the last video, we explored a lot of the structures here at Mount Vernon. This is the greenhouse. So this is where Washington would have kept a lot of his tropical plants that needed to stay warm throughout the year. And this isn't the original structure. The original burned down in 1835. And the story behind the reconstruction is pretty cool. But there's more to this building. So we're going to link up with Jeremy on the other side. And he's going to give us some insight into the history behind this structure.
So we're now on the area we call the North Lane Slave Quarters. Mount Vernon itself is 5 farms on 8,000 acres of land. And on this property, there were 317 enslaved men, women, and children. Now, it's a little complicated as to the breakdown. George Washington himself personally owns, by the laws of the day, 123 of these individuals. 153 were dower slaves that were brought in through the marriage to Mrs. Washington. She had a husband beforehand who died without a will, and she had life rights to his property, which included enslaved people. 40 individuals were rented as part of a land deal for Washington to purchase more property. One of those individuals, Peter Hardiman, was here as part of a lease deal for a racehorse. So you can see by the times, at the time, these human beings were just considered a commodity, a tool, a thing, really. And George Washington himself was born into this society. When he was only 11 years old, his father dies, and he inherits from his father's property enslaved human beings. And Washington, growing up in a society that had laws that not only allowed for slavery, but perpetuated the system, didn't really see anything wrong with it at that time. He saw it as a means of increasing his wealth and his prominence and all of that. However, during the Revolutionary War, we start to see a little bit of change in his thinking. Washington's meeting men like the Marquis de Lafayette and John Lawrence, who told him, maybe these ideals, these principles of the revolution should apply to everybody and not just the privileged few. And when Washington returns from the Revolutionary War, we start to see a little bit of a change in how he approaches his enslaved labor force. First off, he stops purchasing enslaved people. He also stops selling them. He writes out that he knows that selling individuals breaks apart families, and that this is a traumatic thing that takes place. We also see Washington in private correspondence writing letters talking about ways to end slavery, either his own involvement in the institution or on a larger scale. He actually tries to rent his outlying farms to receive an income on the condition that the enslaved people who live there become employees, workers, are able to gain their freedom. He's unable to find anyone willing to do that. And he's also writing that he feels that legislature needs to pass laws that will lead to the gradual abolition of slavery. Now again, I reiterate that these were all private letters. Publicly, Washington is very quiet. He is being petitioned by the Quaker community and abolitionists and others who are saying slavery is wrong. It's against everything you fought for, everything you stand for. But Washington sadly understands that this young nation is very much tied to this labor force, this awful institution of slavery. And he knows that if he makes actions now, it would probably lead to the disunion of the young country. So the problem gets kicked down the line. Privately, though, personally, Washington does eventually make arrangements in his will to allow for the freedom of the 123 individuals that he owns outright. In his will, he writes that all of those that he owns are to receive their freedom upon his death and the death of Mrs. Washington. Mrs. Washington actually didn't wait until that time, and 1801, she actually allows for the emancipation of the Washington individuals. It's possible she was just trying to follow out her husband's wishes, but we actually have a nice letter from Abigail Adams, who came to visit Mount Vernon after General Washington's death in 1799, and she Mrs. Washington confided in Abigail Adams that she knew that there were over 100 individuals who knew that their freedom depended upon Mrs. Washington's life. So whether or not she may have been afraid for her own safety, we're not entirely sure, but you could see how complicated this institution was throughout Washington's lifetime.
Now, the room that we're walking into right now is being depicted as the women's bunkhouse. And there was a Polish visitor to Mount Vernon who wrote that there would be about 16 to 20 enslaved individuals who would all be bunked up in the same room. So, quite the stark dichotomy to what you see in the Mount Vernon home. And the kids would have to sleep on bedrolls on the floor. So you can see they have like a little doll there, and some different toys like marbles and whatnot depicted in this room. They also have some other items that tell a little bit of the story of the enslaved people who worked at Mount Vernon. For example, we have this spinning wheel. So enslaved individuals who were too old to work in the fields might be put to work making clothing or doing spinning. There's one seamstress who was apparently very talented by the name of Charlotte who worked here. And whenever you come to Mount Vernon, well, you can learn a little bit more about her story.
Some of these other rooms we have, you want to follow me down here? We have a shoemaker shop. Now, the shoemaker was in charge of repairing the shoes that the enslaved people were using. They were given, a set for every few years, and they had to maintain them and keep them up. Now, at the end of Washington's life, the shoemaker was actually William Lee. You remember, was talking about Frank Lee inside the house. They were actually brothers. William Lee was General Washington's valet prior to Christopher Shields, who we also mentioned inside the house. William Lee was with Washington during the Revolutionary War, served with him. It was stated that he was the only other man who could keep up with Washington on horseback. After the war, during the presidency, William Lee suffered 2 separate accidents that left him with 2 broken kneecaps. So he was unable to continue his duties as the enslaved valet, so he became the shoemaker here. In Washington's will, I mentioned before, the 123 enslaved individuals who received their emancipation upon the death of General and Mrs. Washington. There was one exception, and that was William Lee. Due to his service during the war, Washington gave him the option to take his emancipation immediately if he chose to take it, which of course he did. He stayed on here as the shoemaker, and every time there were former officers or soldiers who came to visit at Mount Vernon, they would come see William Lee, who could then tell them stories about General Washington during the war.
Okay, now this room right here is the stove room. So keep in mind, we're on the back side of the greenhouse here, and the stove room was not used to keep the people warm in the slave quarters. This was used to keep the greenhouse warm so that the tropical plants didn't die. So there would be an individual keeping a fire burning here 24 hours a day. The room that I'm entering into right now is the men's bunk room, and this would have been empty most of the time because most of the men would have been out in the fields working, so it would have been crowded at night, but largely vacant during the day. And then you can imagine anywhere from 10, 15, 20 guys all stacked up in these bunks. And if you look over here, you can see this bowl with some cornmeal in it and also a couple of fish. This would have made up the daily rations for the individuals that worked here as enslaved people on the Mount Vernon property. Now, in the limited amount of free time that they did have, well, you can see there's a little animal trap here. So men would go out and they would fish, they would hunt for rabbits or raccoons or whatever as a means of supplementing their diet. And one thing that I really do appreciate, so they have all of these different, information pieces here where you can read about the enslaved individuals, but they also have their names. Men like Nat and George, who were blacksmiths, James and Davy, who were carpenters, and George and Harry, who were gardeners. So these people are not forgotten. So this structure right here, as we've mentioned, is not the original structure. The original burned down in the 1830s from a fire that started right here in the stove room that I mentioned earlier. Whenever they reconstructed this building, these bricks were taken from bricks that were part of the original White House. The White House got kind of a redesign and an update in the 1950s. So they took bricks from there, brought them here to reconstruct the slave quarters and the greenhouse. And there's something that is so incredibly interesting right up here that I want to show. So again, what we are looking at here are bricks from the original White House. And if you didn't know, you would pass right by this. But when you look at this particular brick, you can see 3 little unusual markings. Those are the fingerprints of an enslaved individual who would have built that brick. That is something else. So as I've already kind of mentioned, one thing that I really like that they have done here at Mount Vernon is they're telling the fuller story of this place. It's not just about George Washington, but also about the enslaved people that lived here. But this is nothing new. This is not like a new push that they've had. In 1929, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association placed a marker at a place that they found a bunch of graves of the enslaved people here. Anyway, we're going to go and take a look at that now. All right, so we are entering in through this archway at the burial ground of the enslaved people who lived and worked and died here at Mount Vernon. Now, one thing, if you come to Mount Vernon, that you have to look out for, yeah, here I just found a spot. So, I don't know if we'll be able to see it or not. Yeah, you can see it. Every once in a while, you can see these little pegs or stakes with string around them. Those are some of the enslaved people's graves that have been located and marked here in the slave cemetery. Okay, now you might be able to see these a little bit better. So really what we're looking at is an ongoing archaeological site where they are still locating these graves. Now they're not digging them up, so don't misunderstand there. What they're doing is taking soil samples, looking where the ground has been disturbed, and then using that information to mark off these graves. Some of them are smaller than others, indicating children instead of adults. But yeah, I'm glad that they are taking efforts here to make sure that these people haven't been forgotten. So here is the marker that was placed here in 1929. It says, "In many of the many faithful colored servants of the Washington family buried at Mount Vernon from 1760 to 1860, their unidentified graves surround this spot." So there's some language in there that's a little bit problematic in today's context, but I think that we can have some grace towards the people who placed this in 1929. Pretty remarkable. Now, the elephant in the room in all of this is the fact that George Washington, as one of the founding fathers and advocates of freedom, was a slaveholder here at Mount Vernon. And I think it would be very easy to be hypercritical of George Washington for kind of those contradictory stances in life. Personally, and this is just me, I'm willing to give a little bit of grace to George Washington. Now, there's no excusing slavery. It was evil, it was wrong, it's something that should have never have happened. But keep in mind that George Washington was born into a world where slavery had been the norm for thousands of years. And what we see in George Washington that I think is admirable is an evolution of thought over the course of his life, to where by the end, at least in private correspondence, he was advocating for the abolition of slaves. But what may seem simple to us now may have not been so simple back then. Who knows? What are we doing now that societies 200 and 300 years from now will be horrified at? Something that we think is common practice. So again, I'm willing to extend, a little bit of grace, while at the same time acknowledging the fact that the institution of slavery was an evil thing. But anyway, those are some of the things that you think about whenever you were here at Mount Vernon. So anyway, again, so glad that they are telling these stories and keeping that history alive.